First of all, let's think about, we're looking at perfect square trinomials. What's a perfect square? Let's start with that. What's a perfect square? How do you know that 4 is a perfect square? What's the square root of 4? Okay, so the square root is a whole number. It's not a decimal. What's another example of a perfect square? 9 is a perfect square. 16, good. 25, and so on. Okay, these are all perfect squares because the square roots are whole numbers. They're not going to be decimals. Is 2 a perfect square? What's the square root of 2? Okay, so I'll round it off to approximately 1.4. So that's not a perfect square. What is a trinomial? Yeah, an expression that has 3 terms. Okay? An example of a perfect square trinomial would be x squared plus 8x plus 16. How do we know that this is a perfect square trinomial? Well, first of all, trinomial means it has 3 terms. Does this have 3 terms? Yep. Yes. It has an x squared term, a positive 8x term, and a positive 16 term. What is the coefficient of x squared? What number can I put in front of that? A 1, right? A perfect square trinomial means that the first term and the last term are perfect squares, okay?
Take your hat off, please.
Is 1 a perfect square? What's the square root of 1? 1. And is 16 a perfect square?
Yeah.
What's the square root of 16? Okay, so this is one of the criteria. A perfect square trinomial, the first term, so the coefficient of x squared will be a perfect square, and the constant term, which is 16, will also be a perfect square. What about the middle term, which we refer to as b, right? ax squared plus bx plus c. So what about b? And if you take the square root of the first term, which is 1, and we multiply it by the square root of the last term, which is, so 1 times 4, okay? And you multiply that by 2. What's 4 times 2? 8. That will give you b, okay?
So it would be 1 times 4.
So we would take, to find b, we would take the square root of a, so the first term, or the coefficient of x squared, the square root of c, which is a constant term, and multiply it by 2. So let's try another example. Let's do that. Let's find b. Okay, so as an example, I want to find b. So to find b, I take the square root of the first term of x squared, of a, sorry. What's the square root of a? 1. Times, what's the square root of c? 3. And then I multiply that by 2. So what's 1 times 3? 3 times 2 equals 6. So this perfect square trinomial would be x squared plus 6x plus 9. That's a perfect square trinomial. Okay? So if we need to find c, you're working backwards. The opposite of multiplication is division. So I'm going to take b and divide it by 2 instead of multiplying it by 2. And what's the opposite of square root? Square. That's how you find c, okay? So to find c, we take b. So let's do this one. C is equal to, what's b? 8 divided by 2 squared. What's 8 divided by 2? What's 4 squared? So c equals 16. So this trinomial would be, this perfect square trinomial would be 8 squared plus 8x plus 16. Let's check to see if that made sense. Let's see if it makes sense. How do we find b? Let's see now if b is correct. Square root of the first term, which is 1, times the square root of the last term, which is, and then multiply it by 2. What's 4 times 2? 8. So it works both ways, okay? Okay, just checking our work. Okay, so as another review, how do I factor a perfect square trinomial? You're looking for 2 things that multiply together, right? Multiplication is the opposite of factoring, or sorry, expanding is the opposite of factoring. So 2 things that multiply together to give me 1x squared. So what's the square root of x squared? What's the square root of x squared? X, 1x or x. X times x is x squared. And what's the square root of 16? What times what is 16? You look to b to see what sign it is. So b is what? Positive. That means that our factors will both be positive. And that's it. That's how I factor a perfect square trinomial. Okay, so to factor, again, we're looking for two things that multiply together. So we're going to take the square root of the first term. What's the square root of x squared? X, or, yep. And what's the square root of the last term? And because the b is a negative, it's going to be, both of them will be negatives. Okay?
Made with Doodlecast Pro.